Hello and welcome back to Bedtime Stories from First UCC. I'm John Bauman and we are on Chapter 10 of The King's Messenger by Carolyn, Clare Givens, illustrated by Stephen Hesselman. We're on Chapter 10, The King's Land. Starts off with a quote from Psalm 85, verse 10. Mercy and truth have met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed. Psalm 85:10. Smuggins stood as he always had, but knowing it might be the final time in the king's courtroom. One by one, the king's messengers had returned with word from all over the kingdom. The enemy's troops were laying down arms everywhere. The king had sent his messengers out to the ends of the kingdom with a single message. He offered forgiveness. As they each returned, the messengers told the same story again and again. Most of the camp submitted immediately. They had already heard about the enemy's fall and quitted their attack on the village. They offered their allegiance and service to the king. There were still a few who didn't want to serve you, your majesty. Any who were not willing to serve left the kingdom. All of the messengers had returned except Misha. Misha had been sent on a long journey for her first time as a messenger to the east. But no one had heard word from the eastern region in many weeks, and the king was concerned about the enemy's followers there. With success in each of the other regions of the kingdom, that concern had lessened slightly. As Smuggins stood waiting with the others, he began to wonder what would happen after Misha returned. If she brought good news, everything would change. For so long, the danger of revolt within the kingdom had been a reality. Without that danger, the rule of the messengers would be greatly diminished. If they were needed at all, everyone in the kingdom would be at the service of the king. The messengers would be no different from anyone else. Smuggins felt that it would be rather lonely not standing there together with Misha and the other messengers in the king's courtroom. Suddenly, there was a commotion outside in the courtyard. Everyone in the king's courtroom turned toward the door. Tension was in every muscle. A moment later, the door opened and Misha entered. As she approached the king's throne, every eye followed her. She curtsied before the king, her head down. "Misha, my messenger," the king said, looking down at her. "I am glad you're safely returned." Misha looked up to the king. It's good to be back." "What news from the east?" the king asked. The governor gave me an audience the day I arrived. He had barely returned from battle himself. The rebellion there was as intense as in the south. The enemy had sent his second in command to lead his followers in the east. The governor's troops fought hard and felt the enemy's sword strike among them. Their losses were great, but they were victorious. There was relief on the governor's face when I delivered your message, and he immediately sent heralds to take the message to the followers of the enemy who remained. Most laid down their arms and pledged allegiance to you, though a few chose exile as you commanded." The courtroom erupted into applause as all the courtiers began to celebrate victory. But the king raised his hand for another moment of silence. "And my fool?" he asked. Your servant has gone to take your message to every kingdom of the earth." Misha broke into a smile, and the king returned it. "All shall hear," Misha said. "All shall hear," the king repeated. Just pause here. Misha throughout this book has been written with a stutter. You know what a stutter is? It's when someone struggles to get words out. Maybe they're nervous, or maybe they just have a problem speaking. As a kid, I actually had a stutter. When I was about your age, watching here, if you're listening to these bedtime stories as children, when I was your age, around kindergarten, I guess, I had a really bad stutter. In fact, every single sentence had stuttering words in it. In fact, most words in a sentence, I stuttered. And still, if I'm trying to think of something to say quickly, I still might stutter, and so it might come out. But I just wanted to explain that Misha is written with a stutter, and that just because you have a stutter doesn't make you any less of a person, just like it doesn't make Misha any less of a messenger. So I just wanted to share that. So, now it goes back to Smuggins. Smuggins was not the only one who could no longer contain his joy. His voice broke out with a cheer, joining the voices of everyone in the courtroom. They rushed forward in celebration. Everyone was laughing and cheering and shaking hands and hugging. Misha was suddenly beside him, and Smuggins hugged her. There was no way to be heard over the roar of the crowd, so they didn't try to speak, but smiled their greeting to each other. It was quite some time before things quieted enough for the king to stand and speak, but eventually all the attention was focused again on the days at the front of the room. Never before in the history of this kingdom has victory been so complete. Never has every subject declared loyalty to the king. We enter a new age. All have heard my message and all serve me. I have defeated the power of the enemy, and he no longer holds any sway. The king looked at the line of messengers along the wall. My messengers have served me well, and I now release them from their service. From now all serve me, and all are mine. He turned back to the room as a whole. So go, all of you. Go from here and live in peace and joy. Victory is complete, and the kingdom serves its king. The crowd erupted into noise again, and rushed around the line of messengers, pulling them from their places and pushing them toward the door to lead the courtiers in taking the king's message to the kingdom. Smuggins grasped Misha's hand so they wouldn't be separated in the crush. They moved forward with the other messengers, out the door of the courtroom and through the courtyard, out into the city streets, shouting the word to all they saw, "Victory is the king's! The land is the king's!" Here's a little scene. As the crowd moved through the city, Smuggins and Misha found themselves falling toward the back of the mass. Everyone who heard the message joined the congregation and continued on, through the city and out its gates to the kingdom beyond. Smuggins' steps slowed as the crowd surged forward, and Misha gripped his arm. They both came to a stop and let everyone pass around them. As the noise of the throng dwindled in the distance, Smuggins and Misha looked at each other. "It's wonderful, isn't it?" Smuggins asked. "Yes," Misha said quietly. "I'm glad you're back," Smuggins said. "Thank you," Misha replied. There was a pause. Then she spoke again. "Everyone has heard the message." "Yes," Smuggins said. "Our job is done." "What are we supposed to do?" Smuggins glanced down the road. The multitude had trampled on their way out. "They're all celebrating. We could still catch them." I think I'd rather be with the king," Misha said. "That's what I was thinking too." They spoke at the same time. "Do you think? Should we?" They looked at each other and read the end of the questions in each other's eyes. Without another word, they turned and made their way back through the silent streets to the king's courtroom. Smuggins had never seen the courtyard empty. Their footsteps made no sound as they crossed the cobblestones. The door to the king's courtroom stood open and they passed through it silently. The room was still, and the king sat alone on his throne. He looked up as Smuggins and Misha approached. "Smuggins? Misha? Why are you not celebrating?" Smuggins didn't quite know what to say. Misha took a step forward and curtsied to the king. "If you please, sir, sir, your majesty, sir, well, the message is spoken, sir, and we don't know what to do as messengers now, sir." Smuggins broke out, "We want to continue to serve you, your majesty, however you need." "Can we?" Misha began. "Can we stay by your side?" The king was silent. Smuggins stood there before the throne waiting for his judgment. Misha was quiet next to him, but he could feel she was as tense as he. The king bowed his head again as Smuggins and Misha waited with bated breath. After a moment, the king stood and looked at them, tears streaming down his cheeks. He stepped down from the dais and wrapped his arms around Smuggins and Misha. "Oh, my messengers," he said, "I do not need you to take my message, for all have heard my story. There are no more battles to be fought." Smuggins felt his heart sink. The king turned away and walked across the courtroom toward his personal quarters. Smuggins watched him go with an ache forming in his heart. The greatest tragedy he could imagine was to be separate from the king's presence each day. The king opened the door to the quarters no messenger had ever entered and stood back, turning again to Smuggins and Misha. He spoke again. "Come, join me at my table, and we will feast together. There will be no battles to fight, but we will find new stories to tell, new work to do. I will be your king, and you will be my friends." Picture of the king. And that is the end of The King's Messenger. Ends with the line, "I will be your king, and you will be my friends." This book has been a joy to read. As I said in the last video, and as I've alluded to in past videos going over these chapters, this book is actually written and meant to convey a deeper story. Most children's books and most stories convey a deeper story. This book in particular conveys the story of God's forgiveness and God's reconciliation. That God, like the king, wants everybody to come back to him. That God, like the king, wants everybody to be happy and live in peace and love. That God, like the king, wants everyone to serve him with a willing heart. And so that's the message of the King's Messenger. And we learned many valuable lessons along the way. We followed Smuggins, who started off as a shy messenger who was never called upon and was always nervous, to a confident individual who took the message of the king to places that he was afraid to go, and came back and still wanted to serve the king, even after being told that he was free to go. He came back, and what does the ending say? That the king will be their king, and they will be his friends. We have a special opportunity with God in prayer. Remember in Sunday school when they say, at First Church, we fold our hands and close our eyes and listen to the words of, so-and-so's prayer? Prayer is a time when we can connect with God, when we can kind of go to God like a friend. Prayer is God opening his dining room, showing us the table and saying, "Come, let's feast together. Let's have a meal. Let's talk." I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope that I continue to find books that I can share with you along this journey that we don't know how long it will be. But I'm glad that we have this time together, and I'm glad that you've been tuning in and listening, and I hope that you've learned some things along the way. I know that I certainly have. Again, this is The King's Messenger by Carolyn Clare Givens, illustrated by Stephen Hesselman, and it's available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle forms. Please leave a review for this book, because you've heard it all at the permission of the author, and if you've liked this book, please have your parents write a review of this book on Amazon. The link is in this post, and I hope that you all have a good night. See you tomorrow for our next reading adventure.